Chapters 34, 35, and 36 of The Moon and Sixpence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Moon and Sixpence by William Somerset Maugham. Chapter 34. But though I was no less convinced than Struve that the connection between Strickland and Blanche would end disastrously, I did not expect the issue to take the tragic form it did. The summer came, breathless and sultry, and even at night there was no coolness to rest one's jaded nerves. The sun-baked streets seemed to give back the heat that had beat down on them during the day, and the passers-by dragged their feet along them wearily. I had not seen Strickland for weeks. Occupied with other things, I had ceased to think of him and his affairs. Dirk, with his vain lamentations, had begun to bore me, and I avoided his society. It was a sordid business, and I was not inclined to trouble myself with it further. One morning I was working. I sat in my pyjamas. My thoughts wandered, and I thought of the sunny beaches of Brittany and the freshness of the sea. By my side was the empty bowl in which the concierge had brought me my café au lait, and the fragment of croissant which I had not had appetite enough to eat. I heard the concierge in the next room emptying my bath. There was a tinkle at my bell, and I left her to open the door. In a moment I heard Strove's voice asking if I was in. Without moving, I shouted to him to come. He entered the room quickly, and came up to the table at which I sat. "She's killed herself," he said hoarsely. "What do you mean?" I cried, startled. He made movements with his lips as though he were speaking, but no sound issued from them. He gibbered like an idiot. My heart thumped against my ribs, and, I do not know why, I flew into a temper. "For God's sake, collect yourself, man," I said. "What on earth are you talking about?" He made despairing gestures with his hands, but still no words came from his mouth. He might have been struck dumb. I do not know what came over me. I took him by the shoulders and shook him. Looking back, I am vexed that I made such a fool of myself. I suppose the last restless nights had shaken my nerves more than I knew. "Let me sit down," he gasped at length. I filled a glass with St. Galmier, and gave it to him to drink. I held it to his mouth as though he were a child. He gulped down a mouthful, and some of it was spilt on his shirt-front. "Who's killed herself?" I do not know why I asked, for I knew whom he meant. He made an effort to collect himself. "They had a row last night. He went away." "Is she dead?" "No, they've taken her to the hospital." "Then what are you talking about?" I cried impatiently. "Why did you say she'd killed herself?" "Don't be cross with me. I can't tell you anything if you talk to me like that." I clenched my hands, seeking to control my irritation. I attempted a smile. "I'm sorry. Take your time. Don't hurry, there's a good fellow." His round blue eyes behind the spectacles were ghastly with terror. The magnifying glasses he wore distorted them. When the concierge went up this morning to take a letter, she could get no answer to her ring. She heard someone groaning. The door wasn't locked, and she went in. Blanche was lying on the bed. She had been frightfully sick. There was a bottle of oxalic acid on the table. Struve hid his face in his hands and swayed backwards and forwards, groaning. "Was she conscious?" "Yes. Oh, if you knew how she's suffering! I can't bear it! I can't bear it!" His voice rose to a shriek. "Damn it all, you haven't got to bear it!" I cried impatiently. "She's got to bear it!" "How can you be so cruel? What have you done?" "They sent for a doctor and for me, and they told the police. I'd given the concierge 20 francs and told her to send for me if anything happened." He paused a minute, and I saw that what he had to tell me was very hard to say. "When I went she wouldn't speak to me. She told them to send me away. I swore that I forgave her everything, but she wouldn't listen. She tried to beat her head against the wall. The doctor told me that I mustn't remain with her. She kept on saying, 'Send him away.' I went and waited in the studio. And when the ambulance came and they put her on a stretcher, they made me go in the kitchen so that she wouldn't know I was there. While I dressed, for Struve wished me to go at once with him to the hospital, he told me that he had arranged for his wife to have a private room, so that she might at least be spared the sordid promiscuity of a ward. On our way he explained to me why he desired my presence. If she still refused to see him, perhaps she would see me. He begged me to repeat to her that he loved her still. He would reproach her for nothing, but desired only to help her. He made no claim on her, and on her recovery would not seek to induce her to return to him. She would be perfectly free. But when we arrived at the hospital, a gaunt, cheerless building, the mere sight of which was enough to make one's heart sick, and after being directed from this official to that, up endless stairs and through long bare corridors, found the doctor in charge of the case, we were told that the patient was too ill to see anyone that day. The doctor was a little bearded man in white, with an off-hand manner. He evidently looked upon a case as a case, and anxious relatives as a nuisance which must be treated with firmness. Moreover, to him the affair was commonplace. It was just an hysterical woman who had quarrelled with her lover and taken poison. It was constantly happening. At first he thought that Dirk was the cause of the disaster, and he was needlessly brusque with him. When I explained that he was the husband, anxious to forgive, the doctor looked at him suddenly, with curious, searching eyes. I seemed to see in them a hint of mockery. It was true that Struve had the head of the husband who is deceived. The doctor faintly shrugged his shoulders. "There is no immediate danger," he said, in answer to our questioning. "One doesn't know how much she took. It may be that she will get off with a fright. Women are constantly trying to commit suicide for love, but generally they take care not to succeed. It's generally a gesture to arouse pity or terror in their lover." There was in his tone a frigid contempt. It was obvious that to him Blanche Struve was only a unit to be added to this statistical list of attempted suicides in the city of Paris during the current year. He was busy and could waste no more time on us. He told us that if we came at a certain hour next day, should Blanche be better, it might be possible for her husband to see her. So ends Chapter 34. Chapter 35. I scarcely know how we got through that day. Struve could not bear to be alone, and I exhausted myself in efforts to distract him. I took him to the Louvre, and he pretended to look at pictures, but I saw that his thoughts were constantly with his wife. I forced him to eat, and after luncheon I induced him to lie down, but he could not sleep. He accepted willingly my invitation to remain for a few days in my apartment. I gave him books to read, but after a page or two he would put the book down and stare miserably into space. During the evening we played innumerable games of piquet, and bravely, not to disappoint my efforts, he tried to appear interested. Finally I gave him a draught, and he sank into uneasy slumber. When we went again to the hospital we saw a nursing sister. She told us that Blanche seemed a little better, and she went in to ask if she would see her husband. We heard voices in the room in which she lay, and presently the nurse returned to say that the patient refused to see anyone. We had told her that if she refused to see Dirk, the nurse was to ask if she would see me, but this she refused also. Dirk's lips trembled. "I dare not insist," said the nurse. "She is too ill. Perhaps in a day or two she may change her mind." "Is there anyone else she wants to see?" asked Dirk in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. "She says she only wants to be left in peace." Dirk's hands moved strangely, as though they had nothing to do with his body, with a movement of their own. "Will you tell her that if there is anyone else she wishes to see I will bring him? I only want her to be happy." The nurse looked at him with her calm, kind eyes, which had seen all the horror and pain of the world, and yet, filled with the vision of a world without sin, remained serene. "I will tell her when she is a little calmer." Dirk, filled with compassion, begged her to take the message at once. "It may cure her. I beseech you to ask her now." With a faint smile of pity the nurse went back into the room. We heard her low voice, and then, in a voice I did not recognize, the answer, "No, no, no!" The nurse came out again and shook her head. "Was that she who spoke, then?" I asked. "Her voice sounded so strange." It appears that her vocal cords have been burnt by the acid. Dirk gave a low cry of distress. I asked him to go on and wait for me at the entrance, for I wanted to say something to the nurse. He did not ask what it was, but went silently. He seemed to have lost all power of will. He was like an obedient child. "Has she told you why she did it?" I asked. "No, she won't speak. She lies on her back quite quietly. She doesn't move for hours at a time. But she cries always. Her pillow is all wet. She's too weak to use a handkerchief, and the tears just run down her face." It gave me a sudden wrench of the heartstrings. I could have killed Strickland then, and I knew that my voice was trembling when I bade the nurse good-bye. I found Dirk waiting for me on the steps. He seemed to see nothing, and did not notice that I had joined him till I touched him on the arm. We walked along in silence. I tried to imagine what had happened to drive the poor creature to that dreadful step. I presumed that Strickland knew what had happened, for someone must have been to see him from the police, and he must have made his statement. I did not know where he was. I supposed he had gone back to the shabby attic which served him as a studio. It was curious that she should not wish to see him. Perhaps she refused to have him sent for because she knew he would refuse to come. I wondered what an abyss of cruelty she must have looked into that in horror she refused to live. So ends Chapter 35. Chapter 36. The next week was dreadful. Struve went twice a day to the hospital to inquire after his wife, who still declined to see him, and came away at first relieved and hopeful because he was told that she seemed to be growing better, and then in despair because, the complication which the doctor had feared having ensued, recovery was impossible. The nurse was pitiful to his distress, but she had little to say that could console him. The poor woman lay quite still, refusing to speak, with her eyes intent, as though she watched for the coming of death. It could now only be the question of a day or two, and when, late one evening, Struve came to see me, I knew it was to tell me she was dead. He was absolutely exhausted. His volubility had left him at last, and he sank down wearily on my sofa. I felt that no words of condolence availed, and I let him lie there quietly. I feared he would think it heartless if I read, so I sat by the window, smoking a pipe, till he felt inclined to speak. "You've been very kind to me," he said at last. "Every one's been very kind." "Nonsense," I said, a little embarrassed. "At the hospital they told me I might wait. They gave me a chair, and I sat outside the door. When she became unconscious, they said I might go in. Her mouth and chin were all burnt by the acid. It was awful to see her lovely skin all wounded. She died very peacefully, so that I didn't know she was dead till the sister told me." He was too tired to weep. He lay on his back limply, as though all the strength had gone out of his limbs, and presently I saw that he had fallen asleep. It was the first natural sleep he had had for a week. Nature, sometimes so cruel, is sometimes merciful. I covered him and turned down the light. In the morning when I awoke he was still asleep. He had not moved. His gold-rimmed spectacles were still on his nose. So ends Chapter 36.